Hi, I'm Henry Kaiser, one of the senior XR leads for Verizon Media, and today we're going to quickly go over how to make a 2.5D cutout from an image using Photoshop and Blender. We're going to go over this very quickly, a lot quicker than I would normally do in one of my courses, but feel free to pause, follow along for any area that is particularly confusing. And we'll fast forward through some of the really monotonous bits. So today I'm going to be taking this image of Bernie Sanders, and we are going to cut him out, and then we are going to turn him into a 2.5D cutout using Blender. So let's get started. Starting with this file, I'm going to go ahead and just open it with Photoshop. When it loads in, it's just a regular image file in the scene. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to layer it from background, and this is so that when I cut out the background from it, it'll be transparency and it won't be a different color layer. From this point right here, there's a lot of different things you can choose to do. You can use a lot of different tools to delete stuff out. I heavily recommend, for the purposes of when you're transforming this from an image into a vector shape and then from a vector shape into a mesh, using either the magnetic lasso tool or the polygonal lasso tool. And if you don't have these preloaded in your toolbar, you can find them by going to Edit, Toolbar, and they'll be listed on the Extra Tool side, and you'll drag them over to the toolbar side in order to enable those on your tools list. So starting with magnetic lasso, this first pass is going to be very quick and dirty. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on getting every little detailed area correctly because I'm going to go back over the entire thing in a moment here in order to pick up all of the spots that are incorrect. Really what I'm doing myself right now is just a base selection so that from the cleanup pass I'm adding to the selection or removing from the selection. I'm not needing to do each part from scratch. So now that I have at least a base selection layer, I'm going to go back in and I'm going to start either holding Alt to remove a selection or holding Shift to add to my selection. And I'm now using the polygonal tool, not the magnetic tool, in order to select kind of where I'm working on this. So right now I'm really going to truly take my time. I'm going to go over every little area. I find this is actually still a lot easier than using just a like an eraser tool or so forth. All right, so now that I have a cutout of Bernie done, one of the first things you really still want to do, check your work, and that doesn't mean just look at it. It does mean go ahead and off the bat, with your wand tool selected, you can select the inverse to select everything that's not in your selected area that you just outlined. Now I'm going to hit delete, and when doing so I can kind of take a look at the image. Do I like the shape of it? I still really don't like this area down here. I think that maybe actually is some degree the shape that his pants are following, but with that in mind still I'm just going to carve off this little area because I think that's going to look a bit better. And then I'm also, when I'm trying to check to see if this image looks good, one of the things you should really do is add a background layer for a second. So Control Shift N, make a new layer, and then I'm going to take a shape like a rectangle, put it behind Bernie. So when I lay it out, there it is behind him. I'm making sure when I do this, is the trim of him have any areas that maybe didn't stand out to me initially. So now also when I select the void next to Bernie on his layer, let's go ahead and, quick mask is still on, so turn quick mask off. Now I can see okay, no, the dotted line is only wrapping around him, not wrapping around any other areas. It's not uncommon to have little islands somewhere, depending on what tool you used, that could get in the way of the next steps. So looking at this right now, you can see there is still some edge here. That's fine. We're going to, in a second, go ahead and feather a layer out because the cutout we made just now is going to be for two purposes. First, we're going to use it to define the shape of the cutout. And then we're also going to use it to create a layer for lining up the texture image and the shape in Blender. So first things first, let's define Bernie's shape. To do that, we pull the wand tool back out, select the void around him, We're then going to invert the selection, which means we've selected just Bernie. And we are going to then right-click again, and we are going to make a work path. It'll default to 2, that's fine. If it doesn't default to 2, I suggest changing it to 2. That's usually a good number. And then you'll get this little point-based outline of him. Those points are like mathematical points that then have a curve calculated with it. That's great. That's the outline, that's the shape of Bernie in this case. Then by switching to the pen tool, by pressing P or coming over to the bar and selecting the pen tool, I can right-click on the work path and say define custom shape. So by doing that, I'm going to say this is Bernie Sanders 1, in the case that I need to do more than one of these for some reason. And then I'm going to surround Bernie with his boundary. So in order to get guides, this is a guide. In order to get guides, you need to have your ruler turned on. You have to have guides turned on. If you don't have those on, go to View, go to Rulers. In order to get the ruler around the edge, by dragging out of the ruler is how you get a guide. And then Extras, make sure Extras are turned on. Show all these various things, the default things like guides. And then I also recommend at this point turning on Snap. And the reason you want to have Snap on is then your guide will immediately snap onto the highest point in Bernie, and all the other side points we'll do in a second here. If you don't have Snap turned on, make sure that that's turned on. So I grab the first guide, grab another one, I click on the top bar, pull down. So now that's snapped right to the bottom of Bernie. Grab from the left side ruler, pull over, left side of Bernie, and right side of Bernie. So the reason I do this is now when I grab my custom shape tool, I select Bernie, my Bernie shape from the drop down. By clicking in the top left corner, even if I'm not exact, it'll snap to that corner. As I click and drag down, I come down towards the bottom right corner, it snaps into place down there. I let go, and my shape is directly correct, aspect ratio. It perfectly lines up with the image I had there a moment ago. It's still really useful to check your work after you create your shape layer, because it may not exactly match what you cut now that's based on points and curves. So oftentimes I'll take this layer, I'll move it behind my original color layer, and I might just toggle, using the selection tool, toggle it on and off a bit. And what you may see is just a little bit of extra edge, maybe around his head or certain other areas that are getting a little thicker, a little thinner as I toggle on and off. That's fine. That'll all get worked itself out when you make your texture. What's really important is you want to make sure that there are no areas that are really protruding out or really quite different. So by kind of switching the layers around and checking your work in that regard, you can see very quickly is there any area that's become problematic. In this case, nothing at all. So once you've gone ahead and you've made your shape layer, now we need to prepare the other layers that will go into this project. So the other two layers you're going to need besides the shape are a texture layer that will be the final texture you're going to lay on top of your cutout, and then also a layer that I call a cutout or a sync layer, which is really useful for lining up the 3D mesh or the UV map once you've set up your Blender scene. That'll make sense more in a minute, but we'll make both of them right now. So first thing I'm going to do is I don't need the shape layer for now, and I don't need these guides anymore either. What I'm going to do is I'm going to clear the guides off. And with this image layer, I'm going to go ahead and duplicate it. So with the duplicated layer, we have two of them now. I'm going to just designate one is going to be for the sync and one will be for the texture. So with the sync, or let's make the texture layer first. So with the texture layer, I'm going to get my wand tool again, and making sure my texture layer is selected, I'm going to click into the void, and this will select the whole area, the whole null area that's around Bernie. What we're going to do with the texture is, as we pointed out a minute ago, sometimes there's a little red down in the pants or some of the backgrounds around the edge, is we're going to feather all of that. So with Bernie's outline area selected, I'm going to go ahead and right click and select feather, and the feather radius is going to be 5 pixels, which is great. That's usually no more than you need. So I select feather, hit OK, and then I just hit delete. That's the delete key on my keyboard. And in doing that, I've slightly made transparent the edges of burning. You can kind of see that fading into the background. So now when I have the rectangle for the background layer behind it, and I get rid of the dotted line by deselecting everything, you can see it fades in a bit more. If you want to make it fade or feather even more than that, I can select the whole void again, right click again, feather. We can do maybe 10 pixels radius if that's something you want to do. So you can see like what was that dark edge, and it's faded a bit. If we want to clean it up even further, we can always pull out our polygonal lasso tool and go back over this whole area that we want to carve off a bit more. And we can always hit delete and clear that off more. So now we're really kind of just chopping off the colored areas. Okay, so that's an area you can always do. For the texture layer itself, don't be afraid to pull out your eraser tool if you want. That's fine, but you really don't want to use those tools before you've made your texture specific layer. You want the outline shape of it to be based, to have some hard edges. The eraser tool, feathering, so forth, don't make hard edges, and they will make really bad cutout shapes if you try to do that step too early on. That's why we also use these lasso tools, because they'll make hard edges compared to an eraser tool or a wand tool. So there we go. I've cleaned up my texture a little bit. It'll fade in a little nicer into the background. In that regard, also now let's go ahead and focus on our sync layer. So the sync layer, we're going to go ahead and use this for lining up the outline of the UV with the shape of our images. So in that regard, what we could do is we just want to make this a layer that's a support layer, a layer that's make it really easy to line up one edge to another edge. And so I'm going to take this layer and I'm going to add a stroke around the outside. That'll be nice and bold and easy to see. So maybe 2 pixels isn't enough. Let's make it 8 pixels. And this is really going to obviously stand out when we're in Blender because there's this very distinct outline of where is the edge of the shape. So that said, we now have to prepare our canvas for the final exports. So we go to Image, Canvas Size. We're going to be using a 4096 by 4096 pixel size. This is a kind of a standard size for most 3D textures. It'll warn you clipping will occur. That's fine. Whatever your clipping is, once we do make this perfect 4096 square, we're going to select our 3 shape layers, which we turn them all on now. They should all be perfectly in line with one another. And I'm going to use my movement tool, which is these little arrows over here. You can click V on the keyboard, drag this into the corner. So you can see I've like snapped into the side, I pulled down, I snapped onto the bottom wall. And then I'm going to free transform this entire thing. And so to do that, I tend to just do the hotkey Control T. And you'll see I have the free transform box up here. If you don't want to do that, you can, I think there's a way of just right-clicking, getting free transform. Yeah, so on the selection tool, you can right-click and free transform. I tend to do Control T. If you want, you can try to stretch this up, but usually won't snap into the top layer. So instead of doing that, what I'll do is I will come up to height. So up on the tool, the actual menu bar for free transforming, you'll see there's X, Y, W, and H. H is height. I know my height right now is always 4096, so I'm going to do 4096. And if it doesn't say PX for you already, I'll type out PX for pixels. Sometimes it'll start by being a percentage sign, which that's way too much. So make sure you don't use a percentage. Use PX for pixel. And when I do that, it'll have made the perfect height, but it might extend it beyond the bounds now. So go ahead and just make sure that you pull it back up so it's snapped into the bottom, left, and top edges. You should get a little pink line across the middle too to show that you are perfectly in the center. So that's now exactly 4096 pixels high, and it's perfectly snapped to the left-hand side. That all done, I hit enter. Again, I did that for all 3 layers at once. We're now ready to start exporting our images out of this project. So the very first one we're going to do is the shape layer. I take Bernie Sanders' shape layer. I also at this stage usually rename it to whatever I want the final object to be. That just makes my life in Blender easier later. So this is now just says Bernie Sanders. And I go over to File. And this will be one exception we do compared to the others. We do export, not save as. More often than not, use save as for projects. Instead, we're going to go to export, export as. And the first time you open this, very likely the format is going to load as quote-unquote PNG. Not quote-unquote, it'll be loaded as a PNG. You're going to come down and select SVG, which is a scalable vector graphic. And a scalable vector graphic is something we can load into Blender. So SVG, you'll see your 4096s. You'll see kind of a preview of the shape. I press export, and because I'm about to make a bunch of different Sanders files, instead of just needing to pay attention to what the file type is, I'll also name these. So Sanders-shape in this case, because it's the shape file. So that one is done and made. Next we have, let's make the texture file next. So the texture file requires the texture layer and the background. You can decide for you what color should be the background of your project's needs. Mostly lately I've been using black. There's that old mantra that black is slimming. Well, I think black tends to look really good as a background when it's only going to be a couple pixels around the edge usually. You might want to use white. You may have a color for some purpose, especially if you have areas in between the arms or different areas that have like a negative void where you wanted to have that background peek through. Then in that case you're absolutely going to want to have pay attention to what your background layer is, because the mesh you create at the next step, the cutout you create, will not have those holes in there. It'll be flat, so the background's really going to show through in any gaps or voids that you've left. In this case, I'm going to use black, so I take these two layers turned on, the sync layer, the shape layer are turned off, and now I come to File. I'm just going to do Save As this time. I'm going to do Sanders Texture, and this is going to be a JPEG, not an IFF, a JPEG. So Sanders Texture, JPEG, hit save. I tend to keep the quality kind of low because it's going to go into 3D, and I want to save file size because more often than not my projects are going to be streamed on 4G. So I hit OK. I have quality 4. And now the last thing we're going to send out is we're going to send out our sync layer. For our sync layer, it's going to be a transparent background. It's going to have just the sync layer turned on with its stroke. And then we're going to save this because we want to have that transparent background as a PNG, because that file format can support transparency. And we're going to do Sanders-sync. And once again, I always go with the smallest file sizes, even if it takes longer to load. While that one loads, because it does take a while to save, let's go ahead and get started in Blender. So, pop up in Blender, brand new Blender project. For this part here, because I'm going to be moving kind of quickly, you should be able to see every key that I press in the bottom left-hand corner. So let's go ahead and move quickly through this, and you can always pause and slow down and see which keys I pressed. Off the bat, we're clearing out all the default assets in the Blender scene, pressing A to select all, pressing X to delete, and then saying delete OK, yes. So now we've got just an empty scene in front of us. The very next thing we're going to do is we're going to import our shape of Bernie. So File, Import, Scalable Vector Graphic, also .svg. I hit that. I make my way over to my folder for the project. So Sanders-shape SVG is there. And then when it loads in, it may seem a little small, but one thing to keep in mind as you're building 3D projects is that each of these lines represents 1 meter. And so you may just have to zoom in a little bit, but Bernie's definitely not a little over 3 feet tall, but I'm not going to just scale him up to being super huge or whatnot. I should zoom in, work on the correct size of him. For this project too, I do want Bernie to be his actual accurate height. So in order to do that, we're going to be scaling him up and down, okay? But before I scale him, I need to convert him into a mesh. So I right click, I hit convert to mesh. So now he's just this flat mesh. He's no longer, when we import him, he comes in as a curve. By converting him to a mesh, he acts like any other 3D object. And in order to get my math correct on the actual Bernie's height, this line represents 1 meter, so I can pull him down to 1 meter. Okay, his scale is now 0.863, but I want to be able to do math with him really easily, so I'm actually just apply that transform. So now his scale is 1, and we're going to convert his height into meters. So for that, we can always just pull out, Bernie's height is 5'8", so 5 foot 8 inches 2 meters, and actually, a lot of browsers will fill it in for you, 1.727272. So I can come back over to my project and I can say I want him to be 1.727272 and hit enter, and I just have to paste this onto each of the three. And you look at that, Bernie is now the correct height for himself. So he's still flat. That's excellent. Also, this stage is usually when I will go ahead and grab him, slide him over, put him directly on this like center line, and then set his new origin point. So he's on the center line. I can right click and do set origin to 3D cursor. That's this icon down here, or this object over here on the toolbar is the 3D cursor. When you start a new project, it will be at 0, 0, 0, which means I just set his origin to 0, 0, 0. That's a smart way of doing things when I know that this cutout will generally get placed on floors later, and we'll talk about setting his final position at the end of the whole project. So with Bernie laid down flat, the next thing I need to do is prepare him for really, really easy editing. So I'm going to change from object mode into edit mode for this mesh by pressing tab. I can also come over here and do the drop down to edit, but I'm going to do this a lot, so I'm going to be pressing tab. When you do that, you'll see it goes from the outline to all these lines. These are all the triangles that make up the current shape of Bernie. And so I want to make him as simple of an object as possible. And to do that, I want to make him just one face from toe to head. And so with everything selected, like I said, I would edit, I hit A to select everything. I'm going to press F. And if I press F, you'll see he's now one solid object from head to toe. If you don't get a solid object, if you see that there's these gaps in the shape, or if you get an error box that says, merge all faces is not allowed or is invalid, there's something wrong with your cutout, and you probably need to go do that again. And if you have to do it a second time, I really recommend using the polygonal lasso tool in Photoshop all the way around versus a magnetic lasso tool in that case. So with one face for all of Bernie, this is a great moment to set your UV, which means like how do you unwrap Bernie? Well, we're going to have fundamentally a cutout. So it'll have two faces and then an edge in between. We're going to want the cutout to work its way all the way around the edge, which we already have highlighted because there's only one face at the moment. So with everything highlighted in this case, if it's not highlighted, go ahead and make sure you highlight it all. You're going to pull up your unwrap menu, or your UV menu by pressing U, and then I'm going to mark seam. And when I mark the seam, if I now unhighlight everything, you'll see I have this red line that works its way all the way around the outside of the shape, which is great. That means that when I unwrap him, he's going to unwrap perfectly evenly all the way around the outside. See, so if I switch from my vectors or vertex selection to face selection, you'll really see that that red line becomes very, very apparent. So he's unwrapped all the way around the outside. Now I'm going to select him again. Again, I'm using the face select tool. You can also get that by pressing 3 on your keyboard. If you do 1, you're in point select mode, so you're selecting points. If you're in 2, you're in edge select mode. If you're in 3, you're in face select mode. So with face select mode selected, I'm now going to go ahead and extrude him forward. I'm going to add that 3-dimensionality. To show you really what this looks like, I'm going to go ahead and lay my camera over sideways. I'm going to press E to extrude. And when I do that, you can see I make him as tall or short as I want. But I want all of my products to be even, and so when I do this, I tend to type in on my number pad or on my numbers at the top of my keyboard, 0.02, which you can see in the top left corner right now is 2 centimeters or 0.02 meters. So I make all my cutouts generally 0.02. I hit enter, and this is a nice uniform size. It kind of looks like a cutout, maybe out of wood or something. And so now I've made my cutout of my object. He has 2 unwrapped edges, the top and the bottom. Usually you want to have some point that you unwrap the actual side of this. I usually choose a point that people aren't going to see, like something very low or something that's going to be hidden. So if I go into edge selection mode now by pressing 2 or coming up here, select it, click into an area that most people aren't going to notice, and I'll add one more seam by pressing U, pulling up the unwrap menu, mark one more seam, and now this edge would unwrap from this point that we just selected. So that said, we now have a fully unwrapped model. It's got some three-dimensionality to it. Now is a great time to go ahead and create our materials. So I come over to my scene selection. I make sure I click on this, come down to my properties. Right now we're on the transform properties. I'm going to come down to this lower circle to get the material properties. When we load in, we have one default property called SVG material. I'm going to change this in this case to say Bernie front, because that's where we're going to put our images. But I also want a material that's going to be for his sides and the back of him, and it's not going to be made out of images. So for the sides and back, we're going to create a new material for this object as well. Press new. It's going to default to material 1, which is what Blender will call things. Let's call this rear dash and dash sides. Make it super easy to understand. And we're going to apply this material to everything except the front. So the easiest way to do that is with edit mode turned on, face selection tool turned on. I'm going to hit A to select everything, and then I'm going to just get rid of the face, because all minus front equals rear and sides. So all selected, I hold control, I click on the face with my face selection tool, and now everything is selected except the front face. And with my rear and sides material selected, I press assign, and that assigns everything except the front to the rear and the sides material. Right now that's default of just like Blender gray. That's fine. I think that will work well. It also means if I want to change all of it, all I have to do from now on is just change all the colors, and it'll change all that. Right now we're in solid mode, but if I go to material mode, you'll see that there's all the red. So that is for assigning the materials and preparing the materials. Now let's go ahead and give Bernie front its material. So first thing first, we're going to use nodes, and we're going to change the base color, which not using this, but using the circle next to it. Clicking on the circle, I can go to image texture. And while we do have a texture material that we will pull out later, we're still at the syncing phase of lining up the UV map. So we're not going to use texture yet, we're going to use sync. So we attach the sync. Might look a little weird at the moment, that's fine, because we haven't lined anything up. And at this moment here, we're going to split our workspace into two by adding another window. Bring my cursor up into this corner, I get a plus symbol, I can pull over and make a second screen. And this second screen we're going to be using as the UV editor mode, which will be blank at the moment, but we will, from here, take out of this dropdown the Sanders sync.png, which has been linked into the project now. It'll change its zooming, that's fine, I'm going to zoom back out. Hey, look, there's Bernie. And with that bright green line, which we're going to use here in a second, here in my left side 3D viewer, I'm going to make sure I have edit mode turned on. I've got my shape selection tool, and then I'm going to click on the front face, only the front face, so nothing else is selected. And with my front face there, I'm going to pull up my UV menu again by pressing U. And this time we're going to do a smart UV project, okay? And so when I do this, it's going to have all these figures here. You can leave these alone. But they'll say stretch to UV bounds. No. The reason when you stretch to UV bounds, oftentimes your aspect ratio of your projection will get changed. So don't stretch to UV bounds. Just go ahead and press OK with that deselected. And actually, this has never happened before, I'll be honest. It may have actually already lined up pretty close to exactly dead on. So in here, you'll see there's now this little black stuff. That's the dots for your UV. So when my cursor is over in this area, I can press A. And now these are all the points that make up that seam that we identified earlier. What we want to do is we want to line up this orange seam with the green line. Oftentimes you'll get stuff that's like loaded in like this and totally weird. But this actually loaded really close to right on the money. Here, let's mess it up just a little bit so that you guys can see kind of like what we might have to do. So you get something that loads like this sometimes, and now I have to bring it over. So in this case, over here, with all of this selected, again, I pressed A to select all of it. I'm going to be alternating between the G, the R, and the E, which are G, R, and S. R is for rotate, S is for scale, and G is for grab, which is another way of saying like positioning. You can also do it from the toolbar here that pops out on this side if you need it, but I kind of use the hotkeys because we have to make a lot of tweaks. So first things first, like grab it, then like rotate it, and then scale it. And then as you do this, this is a lot of just like knowing how to finagle this into place. Yeah, why is there that little, there the whole time? No, it wasn't. That was, somehow I deselected one point. You might have, just so people know what I was looking at just now, make sure you have all selected when you load something in. Otherwise, you can get rogue points and you're breaking your unwrap. So, once again, pull it over, line it up to some degree, scale it. And when you're really close, you want to make fine adjustments, you can just like press R and use your arrow keys. So I can like now be very delicate, G, arrows. And now, you know what? There we go. The orange is right over top of the green. That is lined up. If you want to like, you know, really fine tune it, you can zoom in and try to fine tune it, but you can also go crazy trying to get it just perfect. We don't need it to be perfect. But this is now lined up. So if I look over here and I turn off my object menu in the actual 3D view, we can see that Bernie's pretty on the money. He's got a little green edge around the outside. That's fine. Usually you want to see basically evenly around the outside. I could probably move this 1 pixel to the left, but I don't think that's going to be necessary. And so what we do now is we change from our sync mode, our sync image, to our final texture image. So come over into my materials properties again, pop open the what file is selected, and now we're going to, instead of using sync, we're going to use texture. And you won't see this image change, but you definitely probably saw that image change because this is controlled by this drop down, not what you have selected here. So like there's my Sanders texture image that's now loaded in the project. I accidentally hit a button just now. And now here in 3D, we can see Bernie without the green edge on him. And that looks pretty great. He probably looks a little washed out to you. That's controlled by these extra properties down here. So what I usually do is like I'll turn his specular from 50% 0.5 to 10% 0.1, turn his roughness from 50% 0.5 to roughness 100%, which is just 1. Now this looks a lot more like the correct image. May still be a little bit washed out feeling. That's fine. That's likely to get controlled by the 3D software you're using to actually publish your scene. I'm not using Blender to publish my scene. I'm just using it to create the model. So that'll get worked out by lighting or other shading properties. But here we are. We've got a lined up text material on our shape. I really don't want this red edge on here, so I'm going to get rid of that. So coming up to my, not Bernie front, but rear and sides, I'm going to make this white again. So like, you know, white. We've got Bernie here. He's still laying down. So let's go ahead and stand him up by click on his object. Instead of using the material properties, we change back to our transform properties. We're going to rotate him 90 on the X. So Bernie pops to his feet. Okay. And we're pretty close to finished. If you didn't change your file names earlier, this is a good time when I usually come into my scene collection, rename these to like something we're actually going to use them for. But this is pretty on the money right now. Right now, his scale and his rotation is, his rotation is 90, his scale is 1.72. I want these to become his new default values. So with him selected, I'm going to press Control A, and we're going to get the apply the transforms menu. So I'm going to press all transforms, and that means that his new rotation is 0, and his scale is 111 because this is the correct size for Bernie. And then the last step we're going to do here is, earlier when we had him in edit mode, one of the first things we did was we got rid of all those triangles that he was made of, and we're making him a flat face. We got to add all those triangles back. And so in edit mode, I'm going to press A to select everything, and I'm going to hit Control T. Control T is going to re-triangulate Bernie, turn him into a bunch of triangles. So with our Bernie cutout finished, he is on the correct origin point. Sometimes make it a little floating foot based on which image you choose. That's your own choice, whether you bring this foot to the ground or let that one be on the ground and kind of not go through the bottom. We're now going to go ahead and take this, and we are going to export him for use in our projects. So I'm going to select just the Bernie Sanders layer of this entire project, or just the Bernie Sanders object. I'm going to go to File, Export, DAE, and I'm going to find my way back to the folder that all my stuff is in. It's this tutorial folder. Now I usually create a new folder called Export, and inside that folder I'm going to put Bernie-cutout cutout.dae. And I'm going to hit export collada. You'll see it exported one object. So now when I open up my folder from this tutorial, inside we're going to see our original folder, our shape, our sync, our texture, but inside the export folder, only the files that are needed for this particular project. So you have the Bernie cutout and you have the Sanders texture. You can go ahead and, if you want, zip these and then send this to someone who you're working with, or just take these two files and open them up in the project directly. So that's how we do cutouts. To recap, we took a source image in Photoshop, we trimmed it, we created a work path and created a custom shape, and then made that shape overlay the original image, then exported the three pieces as a texture, the shape image itself as an SVG, texture as a JPEG, the sync file, which had a stroke around the outside so we can line stuff up, brought it into Blender, imported our SVG, we went ahead and flattened out all of the triangles, marked our seams, put our sync image on top of it, lined everything up, then replaced it with the final texture image, stood it up, and we extruded at one point in the middle, and there you are. We've got our final Bernie piece. So I hope you found that useful, and good luck with your projects.